So Mitch and we've known each other for, I think the better part of 15 years or so. When I was a freshly minted PhD, I was invited to apply for a position down at Baylor. And Mitch was part of the search committee. In the end, I didn't feel called there, but we formed this great friendship, which has existed all these years. We've written some papers and done some things together and exploring other projects. So I think you're in for a treat with Mitch. Now, Mitch, you're not a Texan by background, are you? You've been in the cold country before. Tell us a bit about where you grew up and what ice fishing is like.
That's right. So this feels a little bit more like home because I grew up in Minnesota. So I don't have a drawl like I might if I'd lived in Texas my whole life. But yes, I spent most of my early years in Minnesota, went to college there at the University of Minnesota where I graduated, met my wife, and spent some initial years there in the workforce. Before actually I felt a real leading to be in campus ministry. So I was in campus ministry with Campus Crusade for Christ for a while. If you've heard of, I think they go by Cru now. They've changed in their name.
But by the way, so were you always, was it kind of a Christian family upbringing, and was this a natural path for you, or not?
No. So I mean, we were talking a little bit about this last night. So I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My parents gave me an option when I was 5. They said, "Do you want to go, to church, or do you want to play in your sandbox?" And that was a pretty easy decision at that point. So I didn't go to church most of my life, and then later on in my life, through the exciting opportunity to meet some other people my age, particularly young ladies, I went to Young Life. They told me it would be fun and I'd meet a lot of people. Some of you have heard of Young Life, kind of a fun atmosphere to gradually introduce you to spiritual ideas, and that's what they did to me. And at some point during a retreat, or a week-long retreat, they started sharing parts of the story of Jesus Christ and his great love for us, and I really hadn't heard that before, and it became really clear to me that this was the thing that I was kind of missing and always searching for in my other pursuits, whether it be academic excellence or the right relationship or moderate success in athletics. That I was looking for something that really could only be found in Jesus Christ, and so I decided to follow him in my high school years, and so that was a turning point for sure.
So it was an intentional decision then.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think everyone gets to their story and their faith in different ways, but I appreciate you sharing that. And how did you make the call to go into academia, of all crazy things?
Yeah. Well, this is interesting because when I went into college, and I went through my classes, and I wouldn't say I was like the best student. So you might think the professor is the one who, from early on in his childhood, thought, "I want to be a professor, I want to be a teacher." But I was probably one of those kind of annoying students who was smart enough to do well without working really hard. And I don't want to say I'm a genius, far from it, but so I didn't work too hard, and I hadn't really met a professor that inspired me. I'm hoping to do that to my students, but I hadn't met one I liked, I would say even. And so the idea of being a professor was kind of a crazy idea. But what I did do is I had that initial work experience, and I kind of a little bit hesitant to admit this, but I was in information systems initially when I came out in my degree, and now I really don't even know how to work my phone and my watch, and so it's way above my head. But I really found that to be a wonderful experience in the workplace, and saw what a wonderful environment that was to kind of influence people and make contributions. But I did, like I said, I did want to go back and go into a vocational ministry context because somebody had helped me quite a bit when I was in college in that way. But I had this nagging sense even when I was doing that, and I enjoyed it. For those maybe who have been in that environment or know people, I really enjoyed that, where my 40 hours or more a week I was involved in maybe leading Bible studies or answering spiritual questions.
Sort of campus ministry.
Campus ministry. But I had this kind of nagging sense that this was very good, but there was maybe that more people should be involved in kind of a broader expression of ministry. And so there was a time where I was spending some time reading, as you mentioned, and came across a passage in 2 Corinthians 5 that talks about that we're all ambassadors for Christ. And as I wrestled with that, I realized, that experience.
So say that again, we're all ambassadors for Christ.
Yeah, okay. Ambassadors for Christ.
What's that mean?
Well, I believe that just like ambassadors here that we have, you're representing, and when we send ambassadors out to another country, you're representing the home country and doing your best to speak and consistent with that country and to reflect that country positively. And so the idea that we needed ambassadors in banking even.
Thank you.
Just kidding. We needed in sales. We needed ambassadors throughout. Really was intriguing to me, and so that was on my heart. And even though I enjoyed that kind of full-time vocational ministry, I felt like what I really would love to do would be to kind of, again, rub shoulders with people who are out there kind of in the trenches and to encourage them and spur them on to be what God has called them to be in their workplaces. And so maybe a long answer to what you said, but I mean, that was a passage that really kind of was a turning point for me, and so I decided to go back and get my PhD. Turned out I did pretty well on the test, and they started sending me some things about getting a PhD, and I thought, I wonder. And so, but then as I thought about it, I thought it would be what a privilege it would be to help prepare people like yourself to be in the workplace, to do work excellently, but also to have a clear kind of moral compass and a calling in that environment. So I'm privileged to do that at Baylor, to help equip people to serve as ambassadors wherever they go.
Well, that's a noble calling in many ways, because I think we develop habits when we're young. I mean, Aristotle taught us this, Aquinas taught us this, that we habituate, we develop habits, and to have the opportunity to be touching these young students, MBAs and undergraduates that he teaches, and to put values and a virtuous life into conversation, you're not going to hear that at every school, I can assure you. I thank you for that. By the way, for those of you here for the first time, I meant to mention at the beginning, at some point I'll shift us into an open conversation, so if you have questions on your mind, just keep them, or even just raise your hand as we're going along, but at some point we'll let you jump in as well. So let me ask you a question. So GLF, position the question. GLF, we approach these questions out of the Christian tradition of integrating faith and work, but people often come who aren't Christians that come and are part of our group. We sort of have a big tent approach to it. But if someone is here who's not a Christian, or maybe is a Christian in the audience today, what is Christian ethics? I mean, how does that differ from Jewish ethics or societal ethics or general ethics? Because you're the Siobhan Chair of Christian Ethics.
Yes.
That's not in my title. So tell me about that.
It's kind of imposing in some ways, but yeah, I think the clear maybe difference, and again, this is just that there's a foundation, there's something absolute to point to in ethics, and this is the problem in teaching ethics, and why I think a fair group of folks have said you can't teach ethics, is because if you don't have a foundation, then it does seem to be more situational. Or
like anything goes.
And so, I mean, when we talk about Christian ethics, we're saying that there are certain foundational truths in Scripture that sometimes are a little sticky to navigate, but nonetheless there are foundational truths that can be, that we rely on to then help steer us in a direction of what's good, what's right, what's better.
So what would one or two of those, or a few of these foundational truths be that could translate into our ethical probity and our ethical conduct?
Well, typically when I talk about this, I would say there are a set of commands that certainly provide us some ground rules, and I believe those things are set in the Scriptures for our good, not just for our constraint, but oftentimes having constraint is good. But we definitely can look at those different commands that are in Scripture, whether it be the Ten Commandments, but also those commands that Christ summarized, loving God and loving neighbor. Those commands are for our good, and they certainly lead to productive and positive relationships when we practice those. So there's kind of a set of commands. But as you know, if you've read a bit in there, not every one of your situations is clearly addressed by command in Scripture. So the other thing would be to look at, and this again, you could kind of pull these different philosophical perspectives and lump them in. There's a set of things, philosophies and ethics that kind of have to do with rights and basic universal truths, and those kind of fit with God's commands. There's another set of things, theories and philosophies that are on consequences, utilitarianism, kind of what's good for the greater masses and things like that.
Yeah, the common good, the greater good, that kind of language.
And so those, I think in a scriptural sense, you can look at places where the Scriptures and Jesus Christ in particular is asking us to look at stakeholders, if we want to use that language, that are less powerful than others, and to look at consequences in a different way, maybe even looking at them in terms of consequences for the marginal and the powerless. So I think consequences from a Christian perspective, we have some insight from the faith help us weigh consequences. But I think the bigger question, so if I'm talking with a student, I say, from a Christian perspective, are there any commands that address this situation you're in? Are there any consequences you believe you should consider because of the faith and what we know about following Jesus Christ? And then the big question is, and sometimes this is shown up on wristbands and on slogans, but it really is, what would Jesus do in this situation, which is more of a character-based, virtue ethics. Like in this complex situation, what represents Christian character? What represents the good life that contributes to other people's flourishing as well as your own? And so I kind of look at them as I summarize all these different philosophies and theories into those three questions. Are there a set of commands? Are there some consequences I need to be aware of? And then what's the best route or alternative in light of Christian character, and particularly looking at the life of Christ? Boy, that's a long answer. That's a professor's answer.
But it's a good professor's answer. No, I appreciate that, because, and I think that you're right. The Christian teachings on consequences, and if you take utilitarianism and sort of the philosophical lingo and transpose it into looking at it through a biblical perspective, Jesus he's always upending common logic, and he's. Remember at the end when he says to his disciples, "What you fed me when I was hungry, naked, and poor." And we didn't do that, but so as you've done this to the least of these, you've done it to me. So there's always this reminder to think of the ostracized person, the widow, the orphan, the alien, all these things. But that's a nice three-part way of thinking about it. Are there any direct things that we're kind of told, this is not optional, you need to do this, a command?
Yeah.
Others where you think of outcomes and consequences, and then sort of character. Did you come up with that?
No, I like it all starts with C, because as a professor, you want to have something that is memorable, the 3 C's. I saw that first description of that, although I was in that space due to some other readings, but I saw the first time somebody articulated that in the Theology of Work project.
Right.
But some of you are familiar with Ken Blanchard, kind of pop management kind of guru of the days of the 1-minute manager. Do you remember Ken Blanchard? He came to faith later in life, and it's a kind of a wonderful story about how he kind of reflected on all the things that he did in terms of the 1-minute manager and some other things we use in academia like situational leadership, and then he kind of went on to talk about leading like Jesus. And when he talks about ethics, he uses the same kind of sets of questions. So you can articulate these different. I think the way he talks about it is the first question you'd ask in any situation, is it legal? Is it permissible? Which is kind of the command one. And then he says, related to consequences, he says, is it fair to all the parties involved? And then the last one is, it's kind of like, has to do with character, but he phrases it different ways, like, would you want to tell your kids about this, or would you want it to be on the front page of the newspaper, which is kind of a disclosure principle. And he reflects on those in kind of different they're the same questions articulated in different ways. So I think there's some consensus. Those are 3 pretty good questions to ask yourself in those situations.
And a lot of us are in businesses or lines of work where you don't get to the second 2 questions. It's just, am I in compliance? Will the SEC get me for this? Are we compliant? If so, then anything goes. And of course, that's a challenge. In fact, we were talking in the car this morning. Holly picked us up at the hotel that there are. Well, you tell the story, but there's some large software companies that you were describing that. Share that story.
Well,
some of our students who go to work for them.
I don't know how much you know about Baylor. It's a far, far away in a distant land in the middle of Texas. That's the way I looked at it when they called me to see if I wanted to come down there. I said, where? No, Texas, that's too far. But then I heard about kind of the wonderful vision of Baylor and
in fact, describe what is that
vision?
And
then I'll get to your question.
Yeah,
actually,
we should
he's way off topic. What's the matter with this guy? But I needed to lead in because it was part of our conversation. But so I came down to Baylor because of this wonderful vision of a university, which many have started this way, but few have retained it. I think including Yale and Princeton, right? Unfortunately,
and
right?
Harvard, yeah.
Right. And Harvard, and starting with a faith basis, but then as you aspire to be a research university or to speak in a certain audiences, you start to compromise feels like a pretty strong word here, but yeah, that's kind of what's happened in terms of like lowering those as priorities to maintain faith in order to have other priorities in terms of research or funding be satisfied. But at Baylor, we said we're going to try and stick to our initial foundations there and maintain our Christian voice while we elevate our research stature and maintain our historic Christian emphasis on teaching. So at Baylor, this is how the lead is. I mean, we have a professional sales program, and the person who directs that recognized that the sales environment in particular, but not exclusively, of course, has some serious challenges in terms of ethics. And so I lead a number of different programs on
anyone
campus.
here in sales? Just quick. I mean, pretty much everyone's in sales, right?
Yeah.
Even if it's not in our card. So yeah.
So it's ripe with temptations, let's just say that, all right? So this director said, you know, Mitch, you're doing a lot of programs, and we may get to some of these, but on ethics, and I want my students, my professional sales folks, to be in these ethics programs and really be immersed in that. And it's not the only exposure, because the wonderful thing about Baylor is that if, as a Christian institution, and we're not perfect, we can get to that possibly as well. Yeah. But in the business school, that's part of our DNA, and that this is what we should be doing, practicing business ethically as a witness, as an ambassador of Christ. But so this professional sales program really emphasizes ethics. But I just heard from a recent graduate last week. He called me, and I won't mention the company, but it's a well-known company. And he said, my first job I was doing great within this company, and was recognized for exceeding my sales goals, and so somebody kind of plucked me out of one area and gave and said, hey, we'd love to have you in our unit. And once he got dropped in that unit, he realized that this unit was operating on a different kind of moral basis, maybe a lacking moral basis. And so to get ahead there, the norm was to do some things that he was very uncomfortable with, because he felt like they're clearly wrong, and maybe a couple
exaggerating or misrepresenting products, or even more.
Yes, that, and playing kind of funny with the books, and when you register different sales and so on, and how you registered them, and so he said, here I don't think I can get ahead. I don't think I can even succeed very long, because everyone's doing it. And when I approached my boss and said, hey, here's what I'm hearing is the way things are done here, and I'm really uncomfortable with that. And they said, no, that's the way it's going to be. In fact, then later that next week, he had the supervisor come in and change a sale and move it into another quarter. And so he's not calling me for career advice. Thankfully.
So what do you say to him? I mean, these are real questions, aren't they? Yeah.
Well, this is the classic thing. You could say, oh, well, you get out of there as fast as you can, but in some places, the recommendation for him, it might be because he's powerless. So it's to do the right thing for as long as you feel like you can do the right thing and still be employed, which sometimes is a danger if you don't do what's required in those contexts. And some I would advise to then stay and try to be a light in that situation, to represent a different way of doing business. And so in his case, though, as one of the least powerful in that new unit, he's looking around, and he's going to do his job and do it to the best of his capability for a period of time, but then he's going to go back and get a job in, I think, a master's in finance. And so he was also calling me for a reference for that. So. So I mean, each situation is different. Sometimes it's an encouragement to stay and to try to represent good and ethical job performance, and then sometimes you're kind of overwhelmed by the odds against you, and it's time to look for a different space, a different company. So.
Well, as Jesus even said, he shook the dust from his sandals as he walked from one town to another. So, but I think that's a real dilemma that many of us have been at different times, where do you stay or do you go? And it's a tough call. And one of the things I talk about with my students, for that matter, even when I do my corporate work, is what's the materiality of a situation? So if every flaw or bad practice in the corporate world we stood up against, or anyone stands up against, after a while, no one's going to listen to you. So like a noisy, clanging gong, as the saying goes. So how do you differentiate? How do you pick your battles? Which are the ones that you resign over? Like, I cannot do this in good conscience. Which ones do you compromise, knowing that you're compromising? And which ones do you try to stay totally pure on? Tough questions. Tough questions. Yeah. But I think you're right that we often talk about callings in the Christian world and vocabulary. It's often, I think, portrayed as something where it's just this beautiful, wonderful thing where we're having violins play in the background while we're doing our work that is something we love. But most of the biblical callings were unpleasant tasks, where someone did not have the capability or the skill or the power and were called to do something outrageously big and scary. And the concept is that God provided that difference, what they couldn't do their own, that God did that. So there is a place, I think, for staying for a period of time in a company that's not a healthy place, trying to be a light, as you say, but probably at some point after a season, probably move on if one has that choice. Not everyone has choices.
Yeah. And I mean, we were talking about a story earlier, I think relates to this, although the ethics part of it's only a little sliver of the story. But so in this first space, when I was in information systems, I was in a company, a large kind of multinational pressure and temperature instrument company. It's kind of changed names over the years. At that time, it was called Rosemount Inc. I think it's underneath Emerson now, but in that space. But anyways, there were a whole set of engineers that I also worked with in that space, and I met a guy that I'd known as an acquaintance in college, and we'd been in this Campus Crusade group together and shared some of those positive experiences. But when I met him in the workplace, he was demoralized. He really was. He was just demoralized, felt like this wasn't a worthwhile thing to be there. And one piece of advice that could have been given to him, this is not what I gave him, but is, oh, well, you need to leave that since it's difficult, since it's challenging, since how you're impacting people is not quite clear, and you need to, go into the ministry. Because that was something that he kind of thought, like, I've kind of missed it. I missed the boat. The real spiritual people are in the ministry, and I didn't do that, so I missed the boat. And it was a really wonderful thing to be able to talk to him about, like, this may very well be the place you're supposed to be, because we need people here.
This is your ministry.
Yeah, this is your ministry, and that there's these folks that you're surrounded by, and the questions they're asking about what's right or good in terms of ethics, or even what's important or not important in terms of life, they're not often going to decide, well, maybe I'll go to church and see what they think about it. So most of these folks are never going to grace the inside of a church, and yet you're kind of the hands and feet of Christ there, the light there, that I couldn't get to if I was in full-time vocational work, Christian work. And so it was a wonderful time to kind of encourage him and spur him on that this was where he was supposed to be, that set of engineers that he interacted with and sometimes irritated him and often challenged him with different kind of norms was his ministry. And really kind of turned him around, and was a great lesson to me too, that that's the place he was supposed to be. And so
one of the things we started doing at GLF a couple months ago is we'd send out an email in advance of whoever our guest is and have people send in questions, and so for me to weave into the interview if they didn't get a chance to ask them. So one of the ones that came in for this, are you ready? This is
oh, it's not one of the ones you warned me about. Oh.
No, this is a fresh one. Essentially, it was a pretty aggressive one. It essentially said, how on earth does a guy dare to come from Baylor and talk about ethics when Baylor's had all these ethics scandals in their sports programs and related to that, a whole host of things. Not to beat up on you, but help us think about that. How do you use that as learning points? How do you teach your students? How do you still be loyal to the organization, but you're angry and embarrassed and disappointed? Talk a bit, if you don't mind, about that.
No, sure. And to be clear here, and obviously I'm not a spokesperson from Baylor, so I'll just kind of give you my perspective. But I do think it's a...
By the way, do you want to recap what a couple of them were, just for folks who don't know, not to torture you, but not everyone may know what some of the stories are.
Sure. I mean, the scandal, as it might be described, was where there was a pattern that started to emerge that, and actually the football connection was the higher one because Baylor's football team was starting to get some notoriety, but that there were men who were sexually violating or harassing women in different ways, and that they weren't being held to account, or that perhaps some of this was being discounted, their behavior. And so that was kind of that's the Baylor program, and so it's out of control. But it represented a kind of a microcosm of some things in the sense of what was on campus. And so this is where I'm going to reflect, and again, just my personal perspective.
And ultimately, it took down the president and the chancellor, and a lot of heads rolled as well as the
Yes,
country.
it was related to Title IX, and were students given clear voice and policies and procedures to follow when a rape occurred or some terrible situation like that. So again, I'm not in that space like those. Like, I don't know firsthand some of this happened, but I can reflect on the fact that some of these things happen at Baylor because of who Baylor is. Meaning, we call it the Baylor bubble, and what that means is, and that when you're on Baylor campus, this idea of a Christian faith and that being discussed and being open is that's different than even Waco community, quite different than I'm sure the communities here. But on campus, this kind of everyone's nice, we're part of the Baylor family, is an incredible blessing. The downside of that is the idea of, well, surely no one in this group could ever do anything that bad. And so I think there was kind of a overconfidence that at Baylor, if we were talking about the right things, then no one would do wrong. And so what happened is that we didn't have really a strong and well-developed compliance system and an infrastructure that allowed people to, when something went bad, know clearly who to talk to and even how to handle it. And so I think it was almost rooted in an overconfidence, like that's not going to happen here. And so we didn't develop the systems to handle it when it did. And so I think some good people, and not pointing out anyone in particular, but some good people got caught up in it because they didn't know what to do when they were given information. And then perhaps some people knew what to do and didn't for whatever motivations. But so that was that's a very, very hard lesson and a painful lesson because of the people involved. But it's not a lesson that it's just a specific Baylor thing. I think there's this idea that we can become overconfident in our own morality and can assume the best, and as a result, we don't prepare for the worst. And so that's why when you're doing consulting with companies or when I'm talking with companies, I also teach like executive MBA students, and these are aspiring executives, but we do have a few who are at the top in the C-suite. But I talk to them a lot about making sure that you point to the right values and talk about the right culture, but also prepare your organization with the right infrastructure of training, hotline, compliance systems, all those things to prepare for the worst. And in that sense, we didn't have that preparation for the worst. And I would also say that universities were trying to figure out what Title IX required of universities. And I'm not an expert, and there may be lawyers here who know quite a bit more about that. But it wasn't very clear because it was, in some ways, an executive mandate to move that from gender equity issues to move it across campus and to cover broader. And so universities were trying to figure out what that meant. And so some of that was a hesitation about, well, what should we try and structure? What should we try to implement? And so the silver lining in a real terrible situation is Baylor, because of their commitments to faith, have said this is terrible, this is wrong. There was a quick, disciplining of those that by people losing their jobs, and then a full commitment and a transparent commitment, which is, I think, is a little bit strange. Or we said, what did we do wrong? What are the things we need to fix? And then Baylor's been full on trying to commit all those resources, whether it be to training, to counseling, to student advising, to making sure we create and learn from it, and then be a model of how do you implement those systems for other universities. And kind of behind the scenes, what has happened is people are actually calling and saying, what are you doing? Like, we're so glad it wasn't us, but help us so that we don't experience this situation. And so, but even as Baylor was in the news, there were other universities that were settling these things out of court, and it was quickly going under the radar, and Baylor was kind of split open for everyone to see, because we said, well, we're going to have a external company come and evaluate what we're doing and give us recommendations, and then we're going to publish what those things are and commit to doing them. So there was I think there was 105 recommendations that Baylor has fulfilled, even overfulfilled. That's probably not the best way to say it.
Yeah,
In terms of
yeah.
our commitment for this not to happen. But I think the danger is in our own lives, if I can kind of keep going on this question for a second, because it's a passion of mine, is when we sit in this room and we say that could never happen to me, then we ought to just check ourselves and realize that, you know, in the right dynamics or the wrong context, maybe temptations that any of us could be in our companies could be susceptible to these things.
Mm-hmm.
So that we need to prepare for it. That's part of our leadership roles, to prepare for that and try to minimize the opportunities for those things to happen. Because even good people can be tempted to do very bad things, and often we see that. And I do refer sometimes when I'm talking to leaders in particular about an article that was in Journal of Business Ethics, somewhere we just published our research, we hope, and it was called the Bathsheba syndrome. And for those who've read in the Old Testament, you might this might put a light bulb in your head, about David, who was called a king, who was called man after God's own heart. So you'd call this guy one of the good guys, right? Who then fell into, in this case, sexual sin because of a couple things that happen when leaders, and he was a leader, he was a king. He grew in the opportunities, his understanding of what he could do, right? He had more power. He became more isolated. Fewer people were asking him questions about what he was doing and how he was spending his time. He had achieved a great many things, and his ego and his pride had started to allow him to think, maybe I deserve a little bit for all the things I've done for the kingdom, right? And then pride, again, not reaching out, maybe when he had a temptation, feeling like he could handle this himself. And so if I'm connecting that, or if you're making this connection, what I'm trying to do here is say that leaders, and many of you are these types of leaders in terms of people who've been so very successful and have done the good thing and have a great track record, but at that same time, then you have maybe more opportunities and fewer people who are challenging you. And so we need to be careful to make sure that we have that friend, that time growing spiritually that helps us strengthen us to resist those temptations that we might encounter. And Baylor, we thought, I still do believe it is a good organization with many wonderful people, and this really was a small slice of the pie, but nonetheless, it was a good lesson to us all that you can get caught up in your success and not watch your guard, and bad things can happen. So a good story out of a real bad situation, I think.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because we've seen it in companies. It's not just universities, that companies have had sort of systemic problems that have gone on in different areas. And when you really own it and name it, and not just lawyer up and run the other way, it's amazing what transformation can happen out of a bad situation. And I think you're right. A lot of folks in the media will talk about greed of executives or Wall Street or whatever. And I think the issue isn't so much greed; it's power and pride. Whether it's King David, whether it's the football coach, whether it's the chancellor, that there's a sense that of entitlement that comes after a while. Yeah, I'm working my butt off. I'm doing these great things for this organization. They should be so thankful to me. And so for me to use this car service, or for me to do this, or whatever the different things are, you start going down that track. And because everyone we're talking about are smart people, you could justify it real easily.
Right.
So it's...
and usually starts small. In David's case, it was a big leap, but I think there are actually some evidence there that there was a progression.
I think you mean King David, just want to get this right here.
Yes, let's make sure that King David.
Thanks, old buddy, old pal.
Pardon me. I think even in that record, there's a record of kind of a progression of small things that led up to the big things. So we have to watch our guard for that idea of the slippery slope, right? Yeah. And recognize that a small thing leads to a big thing, and so.
So before I open up to questions, which we'll do in a second, I want to ask you one more question. It's a big topic. Mitch started something at Baylor, sort of an ethics bowl, an ethics competition, training your students to, and then hosting these ethics competitions with different universities and colleges and business schools. Can you describe it briefly and just say what you've gotten out of it and what you think the students get out of it?
Sure. Well, at Baylor, we at one point had a class that was an ethics class, and in some ways that was a good thing. And some of the universities that you're from, or that maybe that you support or you're connected to, might have an ethics class. But what we found is that when you have that class, then it seems like no one else is talking about it in other classes because they think, well, that's the ethics class, so I don't have to worry about that. And so we moved towards...
That's the do-goody class for Sunday school.
Yeah, and so I don't have to do that. I can just talk about what I want to talk about, accounting, marketing, finance, whatever it is. Then we realized what we really want to have happen is actually have conversations about ethics with the accounting professor, with the finance professor, with the marketing professor. And so we encouraged professors to do that and didn't require the class anymore. But then we realized not everyone's as comfortable about that, so they charged me. I actually was not trained as a philosopher. I was trained more as a leadership professor. And so they said, but you seem to talk a lot about values and ethics, so why don't you take on this mantle of the Siobhan Chair of Christian Ethics? And so when I stepped into that, I realized, well, how I could contribute to professors and students learning about ethics or contribute to the conversation was to hold a forum. Now, we originally had a forum which was a luncheon, and a small set of students could be involved in that, and that wasn't very satisfying. I didn't think we were making much contribution to students thinking about ethics through that. So we expanded it to, sometimes it runs as long as 3 weeks and has a combination of things in there. One would be keynotes. So folks like yourself would come in and talk about what they're trying to do in their workplace in terms of ethics and leadership, their examples. And so we try to include in that some positive role models because just as we were talking about virtue ethics, you learn and we learn often, right, by seeing people modeling something positive. So I want to get those people on campus. But that's still passive, kind of like what's happening here, right? And the Q&A we might change this a little bit. But you're learning maybe something, but not as much as if you were engaging in it. And so we decided, let's add this level of engagement, which pedagogy would suggest that's going to help us all retain it. So we introduced some competitions. We started with our students a case competition. I would write a case based out of a recent situation, and so it was kind of live, something they might have read about. And now we're going to actually have to analyze what's going on in this company and what went wrong and what needs to happen to turn them around. So we started having those kinds of case competitions. Worked really well, so then we decided to start inviting MBA teams from other universities to come, and so now we have a national MBA case competition that's gone for 10 years.
That's great.
Where we invite these MBA teams to come and wrestle with ethical issues, and so we have several competitions that's going on. But then,
and by the way, are they just sort of quote unquote Christian themed schools, or are they from anybody or?
No, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, no, there's
different MBA programs.
Yeah, it's not a Christian ethics competition, so it's an ethics competition, and so we don't we're not shy about describing who Baylor is, but we don't. There's not a criteria for them to meet related to mentioning a Christian perspective because they're coming from across the board. So
does Yale School of Management come, Hank? Are they in this?
We'll have to make an invite.
There we go.
We've had we've pulled from kind of connections of people we know, and sure. So we haven't advertised it in some sense because we don't have it. We want this small group to come and be treated really well, and so it's been invitation only, and so our connections. So we've had Notre Dame there. We've had Auburn. This year's winners were University of Pittsburgh, Brigham Young University, and who was my third place team? I think it was. Hold on. I could just say any university you wouldn't even know, but I'm trying to remember the right one.
Sorry.
But so anyways, so we invite these schools. They come in, they get a case on Wednesday, they wrestle with it all Thursday, put together a presentation, and then they present that in front of a set of judges, much like yourself. If you're ever coming through Texas in November or interested in that, coming flying in and seeing what it looks like in November, you could be a judge in one of our competitions, and you're judging to the extent to which they've understood the issues and they've applied practical applications that are really going to work. We're not looking for pie-in-the-sky recommendations. We're looking for those kind of nitty-gritty recommendations that are really going to work. They might cost something, but they're going to result in kind of long-term sustainability of the company because companies that are ethical actually perform better over the long haul. So you can contribute to that by thinking smartly and specifically about what to do. So that we have those kind of competitions. We also have one competition that all the students at Baylor in the business school are exposed to called the Ethics Slam. Now there's something about this I'm going to admit, and you're going to realize right off the bat it's a bad idea. that turned into an okay idea. I had watched, I'm a little ashamed to admit this, but I'd watched a show that I think, maybe it's not on anymore, but it was called American Idol. You ever heard of this? Okay. All right, none of you have ever watched it, but you know it's somewhere out there. All right, so anyways, I watched this show and I thought, wow, I wonder if we could actually put people on stage and put them in a situation where they had to respond to an ethics scenario, and then we could vote on how well they did. And so I created this thing called the Ethics Slam, and we changed it from Ethics Idol, because that just didn't feel right, Ethics Idol. So we changed it to Ethics Slam, and the slam parts has to do a little bit with those who might be poetry buffs. There's something called poetry slams, where you kind of spontaneously get up, read some poetry. And so these are spontaneous opportunities to respond to ethical situations, and then they are, in a sense, there's little clickers that students have, and they vote on the top ones, and those folks go on and win prizes. We give them money because we want to say, hey, ethics pays. So we do that, and that's wonderful. But those scenarios, just for application for you folks, so what that means, instead of a case like this organization I don't work at, it's these conversations you have with people that you're probably know and are going to see tomorrow. So we start out with some conversations about what happens when your roommate does this. Says, hey, I've got the test from last semester. Do you want it? Or a roommate says, I know you're struggling, you've got a lot, this is a real terrible week. Do you want some of my Adderall to kind of give you a boost? And so these are people not some shady person on the side of the street that says, hey, do you want some drugs, or do you want some, And so we're teaching them in that context, like, how do you say no, but say it in a way that preserves the relationship? So it's kind of a simple, we call it the no sandwich. You probably use this in different ways with feedback, but you say...
No sandwich?
The no sandwich. So thank you for trying to help me on that, but no, I don't want the Adderall, or I don't want the answers. But hey, if we could study together tonight, that would be real helpful. So you sandwich a no with two positive statements that affirm the relationship. Because just like the story I mentioned about a supervisor, sometimes the person who's inviting you to be unethical thinks they're doing it for your best benefit. Like, you'll be able to get your bonus if you do this. But you've got to say no to them, but you've got to see them tomorrow. Or you got to go to lunch with them later this afternoon. And so you have to have the skill to be able to say no and maintain your morals, but also maintain the relationship and be savvy about it.
That's a really important point. I think that...
Decide it's a relationship you don't want to continue.
Well,
that's right. Some, if it's that request is so extreme, you're right.
But the idea, I think, that being a sanctimonious, holier-than-thou person just doesn't tend to fly too well in organizations. But I'd like to say we should give Mitch a huge round of applause for joining us. Thank you.